Story 1.
Story 1. The cabin that was an empty solo trip phase of life. I was 26 when this happened. Back when I measured time in trail miles instead of deadlines. I wasn't married yet. No kids. No mortgage. Just a decent job. A reliable truck. And a habit of disappearing into the woods whenever I felt restless. Solo backpacking was how I reset. 3 or 4 times a year I'd drive out to the Appalachians, pick a less traveled trail in a national forest, and hike until the noise in my head leveled out. I wasn't reckless about it. I carried a Garmin, InReach, a paper map and compass, water filtration, layered clothing, and enough food for an extra day in case something went wrong. I logged my route with a friend before leaving. I'd been doing trips like that for years without incident. Isolation never scared me. If anything, it felt cleaner than being around people. That particular trip was in a remote stretch of forest where cell service disappeared 10 minutes past the trailhead. That was the point. I went out there to be alone. The storm and the shelter. The forecast had called for scattered showers late in the evening. Nothing dramatic. Around 2 in the afternoon, though, I noticed the air shift. It got heavy and strangely still, like the woods were holding their breath. Then the wind hit. Not a gradual breeze, one hard push that bent the treetops and sent loose leaves spiraling down the trail. Within minutes, the sky went from gray to almost purple. Thunder rolled somewhere to the west, closer than I liked, and lightning cracked sharp enough that I felt it in my chest. I checked my map. I was on an exposed ridgeline with no real cover. Hiking through rain is one thing. Hiking at elevation with lightning walking toward you is another. I cut off the trail, heading downhill through thicker timber to find lower ground. The rain started as a sheet, instantly soaking through my outer layer. That's when I saw it through the trees. A small, single-room cabin tucked maybe 50 yards off my left. Dark wood, low roof, almost blending into the forest. Relief replaced concerns so fast it was embarrassing. I actually laughed under my breath. Shelterment, dry gear, time to wait it out. But as I stepped closer, something felt off. The structure looked old, sure but not abandoned. The wood wasn't rotten the way it should have been. I should have left right then. First, subtle anomalies. The door wasn't locked. It pushed inward with a dry scrape across the floor, and I stepped into a dim, stale-smelling room that was at least dry. That was enough, at first. I dropped my pack, peeled off my soaked outer layer, and stood there listening to the rain hammer the metal roof. Once the immediate urgency wore off, I started looking around. It was a single-room layout, stone fireplace on one wall, long, cold. A narrow cot frame against the far side. A small table near the window. On that table were 2 plastic water jugs and a couple of dented cans. In the corner, near the cot, was a rolled sleeping bag. It didn't look ancient. That was the first thing that didn't sit right. The cabin itself felt decades old, but the sleeping bag looked like something from the last 10 or 15 years. Not new. Just not relic leveled either. I told myself it was probably used by hunters during season. That made sense. Then I noticed the marks. They were clustered along the inside wall, near the doorframe. At first glance, they looked like rough, weathering vertical streaks gouged into the wood. But when I stepped closer, I could see individual scratch patterns. Some shallow, some deeper. None of them orderly. I ran my thumb over one of the deeper grooves. It wasn't rot. It wasn't random splitting. It was deliberate force. I stepped back and looked at the door. Simple latch. Standard for a place like this. But when I opened it to examine the frame, I saw a metal bracket mounted on the outside, positioned for a padlock. There was no way to secure it from the inside. That's when I turned toward the window. Ethos, intact, surprisingly clean. 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 I leaned in and saw 4 screws drilled into the frame, one in each corner pinning it shut. Driven in from the outside. I should have left when I saw the screws, because that raised a question I couldn't answer. Why would you reinforce a window to keep something in? Realization moment. I stood there longer than I should have, just looking between the door, the scratches, and the window. Individuagi. Each thing had a reasonable explanation. Old cabins get modified. Hunters reinforce things. Vandals damage walls. But stacked together, it stopped feeling random. The scratches were all on the inside at hand height, concentrated near the door and window, not scattered across the room. The latch could only be secured from the outside. The window had been fixed shut from the outside, not boarded up against weather-pinned. It hit me all at once, not dramatically, just like a quiet realization settling in. Someone had been kept in here, not sheltered. Contained. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. My first instinct was to grab my pack and step back out into the rain, but the storm outside had intensified. Lightning was hitting close enough to make the cabin walls hum. The trees were thrashing violently. Branches were snapping somewhere beyond the walls. I knew better than to stay in a place that gave me that kind of feeling. And yet I stayed. I told myself the obvious. This was old. Decades old. The wood around the screws was weathered. The scratches weren't fresh. The sleeping bag looked dusty and stiff. Not recently used. Whatever happened here, it wasn't happening now. That's what I chose to believe. Because walking back into that storm felt more dangerous than staying put. The outside presence, the storm didn't ease up. If anything, it grew heavier. Rain hammered the roof in a constant metallic roar, and wind pressed against the walls hard enough to make the structure creak. I told myself that was all I was hearing, just weather punishing old wood. Then I caught something that didn't fit. It was faint at first, a dragging sound along the left exterior wall. Slow, uneven. Not the sharp snap of a branch, but something sustained. I held still, trying to isolate it from the rain. It stopped. A few seconds later, 2 heavy thumps landed on what I assumed was the small porch outside the door. They were spaced too evenly to be debris falling. Too controlled. I stood up without realizing I had. My pulse had picked up before my brain caught up. I stared at the door, listening, trying to convince myself it was just wind, forcing something loose. Silence stretched out longer than it should have. Then I heard it. A shift in pressure against the door. Not a knock. Not a bang. Just weight. Steady, deliberate weight, leaning into it from the outside. The latch gave a small metallic rattle under that pressure. The wood flexed inward half an inch, and then the weight lifted. My mouth had gone dry. The door wasn't locked. If someone was out there, they could have just opened it. Nothing was stopping them, which made the question worse. Why didn't they come in? I should have left the second I heard that weight on the door. Instead, I stayed frozen, trying to explain it away. Maybe someone else had taken shelter under the porch. Maybe they were testing the structure before stepping inside. But if that were true, why circle the cabin, and why lean on the door without opening it? Trap mechanic and fire, I had just decided I was leaving. The storm didn't matter anymore. Whatever was outside felt worse than lightning. I started stuffing my damp layers back into my pack, hands moving faster than my thoughts. The window exploded behind me. Glass burst inward in a spray of shards, and something heavy clattered across the floor. For half a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then the rag wrapped around it caught, and the entire corner of the room flashed orange. Flames rolled up the wall like they'd been waiting. It didn't make sense. It was pouring outside. The roof was metal. The wood inside had looked old and dry, but not that dry. The fire spread unnaturally fast, racing along the wall toward the ceiling. Heat punched the air out of my lungs. I lunged for the door. It wouldn't move. I yanked harder. The latch rattled, but the door held firm, like something heavy had been shoved against it from the outside. Smoke was already pooling along the ceiling, dropping lower by the second. For one stupid second, I turned toward my pack. Don't stop to grab your gear. That thought cut through the panic. I slammed my shoulder into the door. Once. Twice. On the third hit, something on the other side shifted, and the door tore loose from its hinges. Cold rain hit me like a wall. I stumbled out into the storm just as the cabin behind me roared fully alive with fire. Physical attack and survival scramble. I barely made it 10 steps into the trees before something hit me from behind. It wasn't a shove. It was a full-body tackle that drove me face first into the mud. The impact knocked the air out of my chest. My ears rang from the force of it, rain mixing instantly with dirt in my mouth. There was weight on my back, hands grabbing from my neck. Instinct took over. I rolled hard to the side before the choke could lock in fully. We slid in the mud, boots scraping for traction. I caught a glimpse of a sleeve, dark and soaked, but I never saw a face. Every time I tried to turn my head, a form pressed against my jaw, fingers digging toward my eyes. He was breathing hard, not yelling words, just raw sound. I jammed my thumb into whatever I could reach and kicked backward with everything I had. My heel connected with something solid. The grip loosened just enough. I twisted free and scrambled to my feet without looking back. The cabin behind me was fully engulfed now, flames roaring bright against the rain, lighting the trees like a flare. That glow made me feel exposed. Primera ra Anyway, branches tore at my arms. I slipped twice and kept going. I didn't know if he was chasing me. I just knew I couldn't stop. Aftermath and lingering question. I don't remember most of the hike out. Just flashes. Rain. Mud. A logging road. The first headlights I saw felt unreal. The hospital confirmed second-degree burns along my forearm and neck. Smoke inhalation, but not severe. They asked what happened. I told them the truth. The police took a report. An arson in an unmarked stretch of forest isn't exactly easy to investigate. I never heard anything back. Physically, I healed. Mentally, something shifted. I still go outdoors, but never alone. Not anymore. What stays with me isn't just the attack, it's the fire. It was pouring rain. The roof was metal. The flames spread like accelerant had already soaked into the walls. Sometimes I wonder if that cabin wasn't just shelter someone found. Maybe it was something someone prepared, waiting for the next person who needed to get out of the storm.
Story 2.
Story 2. The light beneath the tower airbags friendship dynamic. This happened a couple of years before the cabin incident, back when I still said yes to things without overthinking them. My friend Charles was the kind of person who could find abandoned structures the way other people find restaurants. He lived on satellite maps and obscure forums. If there was a decommissioned building tucked away somewhere, he probably had screenshots of it saved. We balanced each other out. At least that's what we told ourselves. I was the one who double-checked routes and brought extra water. He was the one who pushed boundaries. Not reckless in a chaotic way, just comfortable with risk in a way most people aren't. One Friday he texted me about an old fire lookout tower hidden deep in a forest, about 3 hours from where we lived. Decommissioned for years. No fencing. No active maintenance. Just standing there. We hiked for miles off-trail to reach it. When it finally came into view through the trees, it didn't look real. A tall steel frame, rising straight up out of dense green, with a small glass cab perched at the top. The forest around it felt open and endless. Up there, though, you'd be exposed. Nowhere to go but down. That was the appeal. It felt calm, exciting, but calm. Like we were stepping into something forgotten. Climb and sunset calm up close. The tower looked older than it had from a distance. The paint had peeled down to raw metal in places, and several of the lower railings were bent outward like they'd been hit years ago and never fixed. The staircase zigzagged up in sections, each landing exposed to open air. A few bolts were rusted through, the steps wobbling slightly when we tested them. Charles went first. Of course. Just don't lean your full weight on anything, he called down casually, already 10 feet up. Every instinct in me said, don't climb that. But I did. The metal felt cold and slightly slick under my boots. The higher we went, the more the forest seemed to sink away beneath us. Wind picked up around the halfway point. Not strong, just enough to remind me there was nothing but open air on all sides. The last stretch was a vertical ladder, encased in a narrow metal cage. 20 feet straight up with no break. When I pulled myself into the cab level, my hands were sweating. And then I saw the view. The sun was dropping low, turning the canopy gold and copper. Hills rolled endlessly in every direction. For a moment, it felt peaceful below us, though the forest was already darkening. The light didn't reach the ground evenly, and the silence up there was absolute. The stillness directly below, the light stopped directly beneath us. It didn't flicker. It didn't wander. It just settled into one fixed point at the base of the tower. From our angle, we could see the glow clearly, but whatever was holding it was hidden by the metal platform and shadows. Charles leaned over the railing. "Hey," he called down, louder than I was comfortable with. "You good?" His voice carried cleanly through the trees. No response. The light didn't move. I felt irritation spike through my fear. That was the difference between us. I was thinking about minimizing attention. He was thinking about confronting it. "You don't have to yell," I muttered. He ignored me and tried again, louder. "Hello." Nothing. The forest felt too quiet now. No wind in the leaves, no distant animal movement, just that steady, unmoving glow beneath us. And then the tower answered. A sharp metallic clang echoed up through the frame. It sounded like someone had struck one of the lower beams with something heavy. The vibration traveled through the structure, a subtle tremor under our boots. I stepped back from the railing immediately. That was when the layout of our situation finally registered in a different way. There was only one way down, a single staircase wrapped around an open steel frame. No alternate exit, no bike ladder. If someone was standing at the base, they were blocking everything. Charles was still peering over the side. In that moment, the tower didn't feel adventurous anymore. It felt vertical and exposed. Trap mechanic. The missing section. We didn't sleep. At some point near sunrise, the sky shifted from black to deep blue, and the tension in the cab changed with it. Darkness had been doing most of the work. In daylight, things would make sense again. That's what I told myself. When it was finally bright enough to see clearly, I pushed the door open and stepped onto the walkway. The forest below looked completely normal. No light, no movement, no sign that anyone had ever been there. We packed quickly. Neither of us said much. The goal was simple: get down. Charles started first. I followed close behind, keeping my eyes on the stairs instead of the tree line. The metal felt solid under my boots. Ordinary. We made it down one level, then another. About 3/4 of the way down, Charles stopped so suddenly, I nearly walked into him. "What?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Ejus started. I leaned to the side to see past Imond. My stomach dropped. An entire section of staircase was gone. Not a broken step. Not loose bolts. A full 10-foot segment of metal stairs missing between two landings. Cleanly removed, the gap yawned open beneath us, exposing nothing but air and the forest floor far below. It hit me all at once. The metallic grinding sounds during the night, the vibrations we'd felt. That wasn't random noise. Someone had been working on the tower. But when we hadn't heard sustained clattering, we hadn't heard tools falling. Removing that much steel should have been loud. Obvious. I stared at the gap and felt something colder than fear. If that section had been removed earlier in the night, how had whoever did it crossed back over? And if it had been removed while we were inside the cab, how did we not hear it? Escape and unanswered logic. We stood there longer than we should have, just staring at the gap like it might fix itself if we gave it time. It wasn't an impossible jump, maybe 3 feet across, but 3 feet feels very different when you're suspended 60 feet above the ground, and the landing is rusted metal, the width of a welcome mat. Charles looked back at me. We have to jump. There wasn't another option. Climbing back up wasn't going to change anything. Waiting wasn't going to make the stairs reappear. He went first. He backed up 2 careful steps on the narrow landing, then pushed forward. For a second he hung in the air, boots scraping against the edge on the other side before he caught himself against the railing. But the landing shifted under him. He made a sharp sound, half grunt, half curtsand. I saw his ankle roll awkwardly as he stabilized. The metal groaned under his weight, but it held. "I'm good," he said, though his face didn't agree. I didn't give myself time to think. If I hesitated, I'd freeze. I stepped back once and jumped. My boots cleared the gap cleanly, and I slammed into the opposite railing harder than I meant to. The structure shuddered. For a split second, I imagined the entire tower giving way. It didn't. We didn't look down. We just kept descending. Charles moved slower now, favoring one leg. I stayed behind him, glancing over my shoulder more than I wanted to. The forest looked normal in daylight, sunlight filtering through leaves. No obvious disturbances. No person waiting at the base. When we finally stepped onto solid ground, my legs felt unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with height. We circled the base immediately. There were no discarded metal stairs lying in the brush, no bolts scattered on the ground, no tools, no footprints that stood out, just leaf litter and dirt like any other forest floor. I walked outward in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The silence from the night before felt heavier now, artificial. Charles leaned against one of the support beams, testing his ankle. Maybe it was already like that, he offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," I said automatically. We would have seen it on the way up. We would have felt the gap when climbing. It hadn't been there, which meant someone had removed that section while we were inside the cab. The thought didn't sit right. The light beneath us, the deliberate stillness, the metallic sounds. It formed a sequence that was hard to ignore. I kept replaying one part in my head. The light hadn't moved once it reached the base. It just stayed there, keeping us focused downward, keeping us watching. I've tried to come up with clean explanations over the years. Some elaborate prank, some long-abandoned structural failure we misinterpreted. But there's one question that's never gone away. What if the light wasn't there to approach us? What if it was there to make sure we stayed up top long enough for someone to quietly take away the only way down?
Story 3.
Story 3. Something was working. The trees burn out and solar retreat by the time this happened. I was in my late 30s. I'd been camping alone for close to 15 years at that point. Not recklessly. I understood terrain, weather patterns, animal behavior. I carried what I needed, and nothing extra. On solo trips I also carried a .308 bolt-action rifle. Not because I was paranoid, but because I respected where I was going. That trip was in a massive stretch of national forests. The kind where you can hike all day without crossing another footprint. I'd taken a few days off work after a long stretch that left me wired and exhausted at the same time. I needed quiet. The first day went exactly how I wanted it to. 7 steady miles in. A flat patch near a creek bed. Tent set before dusk. Small, controlled fire ring. Dinner. 1 beer. It was close to midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure what pulled me out of sleep. I just felt alert. I unzipped the tent slightly, and that's when I saw it. A faint orange glow about 200 yards through the trees. A fire, not large, not spreading, just steady. Primera. Listened, no voices, no movement, just the distant flicker. The vanished campfire. The fire was the first thing I thought about when I woke up. It wasn't fear that pushed me out of the tent early. It was curiosity. I'd watched it long enough to know it wasn't lightning or some illusion. It had flickered like a contained campfire. Controlled, intentional. I packed my tent and followed the direction I was almost certain I'd seen it in. The forest there opened into a shallow clearing, maybe the size of a small living room. I recognized the tree line. The angle matched what I'd seen from my tent, but there was nothing. No blackened earth, no ring of stones, no ash, not even disturbed pine needles. The ground was clean, damp from dew, and untouched. I walked the entire perimeter twice. Then I stepped beyond the clearing, scanning for another open patch I might have mistaken in the dark. There wasn't one. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to reason through it. Maybe I'd misjudged the distance. Maybe the fire was further out than I thought. Depth perception at night can play tricks on you. That was the most logical explanation. But I knew where I'd been looking. I should have left right then. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't violent. Just a small inconsistency in a place that doesn't tolerate many of those. Instead, I shrugged it off and moved deeper into the forest. What I didn't consider at the time was a different possibility. Maybe I hadn't found the fire because it hadn't been meant for warmth. Maybe it had been meant for me to see it. And maybe someone had been watching my tent the whole time I was watching that glow. Trees falling without wind. The second night was quieter than the first. No distant glow. No unusual movement. I built a small fire, let it burn down fully, and turned in around 10. The forest felt dense in that section. Older growth, thicker canopy. Even the air seemed heavier. I woke up to a sound I felt before I understood. A deep, splintering crack tore through the darkness. Violent and prolonged. Not a quick snap. This was drawn out wood fibers giving way under massive pressure. It went on for 3, maybe 4 seconds, before ending in a ground-shaking impact. The tent trembled. My first thought was wind, a sudden gust. But there was no wind. The trees outside my tent were still. I lay there, listening, heart accelerating, telling myself large trees sometimes fall on their own. Roots rot, soil shifts, it happens. 10 minutes later, it happened again. Another cracking roar, this time from a completely different direction. Closer, the final thud reverberated through the ground like something enormous had been dropped. 2 massive trees, no storm. No gusts, no thunder. That was when the quiet started feeling wrong. I sat up fully, every nerve alert now. The forest had gone completely still. No insects, no distant rustling, just a suspended kind of silence. And then I heard it. A low, continuous sound that didn't belong to anything I recognized. It wasn't a growl exactly. It wasn't mechanical. It was somewhere in between a deep, sustained groan that rolled through the trees without breaking for breath. It went on for nearly a full minute. Not changing pitch, not escalating. Just present. That was the moment the calm logic I'd been leaning on started to fracture. 2 trees had fallen in separate directions, and something was still out there. Physical evidence and final realization. I didn't sleep again that night. The sound eventually faded, thinning out until it blended back into ordinary forest noise. But ordinate didn't feel real anymore. I lay there with my rifle across my chest, listening to every small shift of fabric, every faint pop of cooling bark outside. When dawn finally came, it didn't bring relief. It just made everything visible. I packed fast. No coffee, no fire. Just broke camp and slung my pack over my shoulders. My legs felt tight and slightly shaky, like I'd been running instead of lying still for hours. I started in the direction of the second crash, the closer one. It didn't take long to find it. The tree was massive, easily 2 feet thick at the base. It lay angled across a shallow slope, branches splintered, bark torn where it had hit the ground. Seeing it in daylight made it more real, but also more confusing. There had been no wind. I approached the stump slowly. The break wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of splintering you see when wind torque snaps a trunk. It looked. Work it? That's the only word I can use. The wood fibers weren't just fractured. They were shredded in uneven strips, like something had applied force repeatedly at different angles. Long gouges ran along the trunk, deep and irregular. Some were easily an inch into the wood. Bark around the base had been stripped in ragged sheets. I crouched down and ran my fingers along one of the grooves. It wasn't smooth like a saw cut. It wasn't symmetrical. It looked torn. I'd seen beaver damage before. Clean, angled incisions. This was nothing like that. I'd seen lightning splits too. That leaves blackened channels and sharp fractures. This was raw, pale wood pulled apart by force. I stepped back slowly. Maybe it had been diseased. Maybe internal rot made it weaker than it looked. That's what I tried to tell myself. There are explanations for almost everything in the woods, if you know where to look. Then I remembered the first crash from the night before. Different direction. Different tree. I turned and scanned the surrounding forest. That's when I saw the other trunk in the distance. It lay at a different angle entirely, deeper in the trees. I didn't walk to it. I didn't need to. Two separate foals, spaced apart, no storm involved. The air felt heavier now. I was about to turn back, toward my pack, when something blue caught my eye, near one of the lower branches of the fallen tree. It was small, out of place. I stepped closer. It was my bandana, the same blue one I'd tied to my pack strap the day before. Next to it was a small silver carabiner, also mine. For a moment, my brain rejected what I was looking at. I reached for my pack automatically, heart thudding in my ears. The bandana was gone from the strap. The carabiner that had been clipped to a side loop wasn't there. I stood up slowly, scanning the woods around me. I hadn't dropped those items. I was careful with my gear. Even if primera day, they would have been somewhere along the trail, not placed neatly near the base of a tree that had fallen in the night. Placed, that was the word that stuck. The bandana wasn't tangled in brush. It wasn't half buried in leaves. It was sitting there, visible. I felt something in my stomach shift. That fire on the first night. The missing evidence in the clearing. The trees fallen in separate directions. The sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. And now, this. It hit me quietly, the same way the realization in the cabin had. I had not been alone at any point during this trip. Not accidentally sharing space with another camper. Not coincidentally near wildlife. Something or someone had known where I was, had access to my camp, had taken something from my pack, and then left it somewhere. I would absolutely find it. A message or proof. My pulse started to spike in a way that felt different from the night before. This wasn't fear of a noise in the dark. This was the understanding that whatever was out here could approach my tent without waking me. The trap mechanic wasn't a locked door or missing stairs. It was psychological. I had been surrounded the entire time and didn't know it. The realization settled in fully when I thought about the layout. The first tree fell to the south of my camp. The second to the northwest. That wasn't random. That was positioning. If something wanted to create a perimeter, that would be how. I suddenly became hyper-aware of how exposed I was standing there. I didn't crouch. I didn't slowly back away. I grabbed the bandana and carabiner without breaking eye contact with the tree line, and moved. Fast. Not sprinting yet, but close. I shoved the items into my pocket and slung my rifle forward into my hands. The forest looked ordinary. That was the worst part. Sunlight through branches. Distant bird calls returning now that daylight was fully in place. Nothing visible. But I no longer trusted visibility. I started heading back the way I'd come the day before, not caring about sticking perfectly to my path. I just needed distance. The hike back to the trailhead should have taken maybe 5 hours at a steady pace. It felt like 15. Every snapped twig behind me made my shoulders tense. Every shift of shadow between trunks looked deliberate. Twice, I stopped and turned fully around, scanning with the rifle raised. Nothing, and that made it worse. If this had been human sabotage, it meant someone skilled enough to approach silently, remove items from my pack, possibly weaken or damage trees, and disappear without being seen. If it wasn't human, I didn't let that thought finish. About halfway back, exhaustion hit me harder than I expected. Not physical exhaustion from distance. Adrenaline burnout. My legs felt hollow. It kept mobbing. I didn't stop to filter water. I didn't stop to rest. I just walked fast and direct, until the trees began to thin and I saw the faint line of the service road ahead. The moment I reached my truck, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors immediately, even though that made no rational sense in a forest. I drove out, without looking in the rearview mirror. I called the police once I had cell service. I told them what happened, the missing items, the trees, the sounds. I could hear the doubt in their voices, even though they were polite. Massive forests don't lend themselves to easy investigations. I don't blame them. I still go camping, but I don't ignore small inconsistencies anymore. And I don't dismiss quiet changes in the environment, because I still don't know what worked those trees down. I don't know who took my gear, and I don't know what that fire on the first night was meant to signal. What I do know is this. Something had access to me in that forest. It moved close enough to take from me. Close enough to position those trees. Close enough that if it had wanted to escalate beyond intimidation, it could have. Sometimes I wonder if it was human. Someone with tools, patience, and a desire to unsettle rather than attack. Other times I think about those gouges in the trunk, and the sound that rolled through the trees for nearly a minute without stopping. If you've spent enough time in the woods, you know when something doesn't belong. That sound didn't belong, and whatever made it knew exactly where I was sleeping.